Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Tommie Shelby about the state's standing to punish and prison reform.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Tommie Shelby, Caldwell Titcomb Professor in the Department of African and African American Studies and the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University. In addition to many articles, Tommie has written several books, including Dark Ghettos, Injustice, Dissent, and Reform, and We Who Are Dark, The Philosophical Foundations of Black Solidarity. And he's co-edited two other books, To Shape a New World, Essays on the Political Philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr., and Hip Hop and Philosophy, Rhyme to Reason. Tommie's newest book, which we'll talk about a little bit today on the podcast, is called The Idea of Prison Abolition. It was published in 2012, and it's based on his Carl G. Hempel lectures, which were delivered at Princeton University in 2018. Tommie has graciously agreed to talk to us today about the standing to punish, and we'll make sure, as I said, to ask him some questions about his most recent book along the way. Welcome to the show, Tommie. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to moral responsibility and punishment in the law?
Well, thanks so much for having me, first of all.
Of course.
Yeah, I could say a little bit about who I am. So, first generation college student, oldest of six, and was lucky enough to find philosophy when I was in college. It's a subject I'd never heard of, but was introduced to it by the urging of professors of mine who thought I might like it, and they were right. I did like it. My mind sort of works that way. And it's sort of become my vocation and profession. I'm interested in lots of different questions in philosophy, but I would say that most of my writing and teaching focuses on moral and political, social and legal philosophy questions. And I'm particularly interested in how the classic questions in those subfields kind of intersect with questions about racial inequality and about Black life in the U.S. in particular. So a lot of what I do is, could be thought of as at the intersection of philosophy and African American studies. I've been mostly preoccupied in my books and articles with what might be described as the race-class conundrum. And I'm interested in that nexus and pretty much all its dimensions. And so some of the things I've written are trying to think about racial injustice and economic injustice, how they interact, structure one another, how attempts to resist those forms of injustice are also structured and shaped by questions of race and class. So the books I've written have mostly focused on those. The book I wrote before The Idea of Prison Abolition and Dark Ghettos, which you mentioned, was one such attempt to kind of think about what is sometimes described as ghetto poverty, questions about the lives of Black people who are living under concentrated disadvantage and segregation in metropolitan areas in the U.S. And I was interested in, lots of different dimensions of that, the problem of that particular subgroup of Black Americans and like the things that they face, thinking about racial inequality and economic injustice, but also questions about mass incarceration and like how the members of that particular subgroup are the ones who find themselves most in conflict with law enforcement and are mostly the ones who find themselves incarcerated. So I was very interested in the range of questions around justice. That's the philosophical bit, the long-standing question. What is justice? What does it really require? But kind of bringing it a little closer to the ground by thinking about this subgroup.
Yeah. Very cool.
That's really interesting.
Our last season of the podcast covered various topics at the intersection of law, the philosophy of law and human agency. And one of the central topics was that of punishment. So before we turn to questions about the standing to punish and prisons in particular, could you tell us what you take punishment to be and on what grounds you take it to be justified?
Give you the short version.
All right.
So I guess I think punishment is best understood as the imposition of sort of unpleasant or unwelcome treatment, sometimes called hard treatment, where this is a penalty for breaking a rule or disobeying a command. That's why I think punishment is kind of very generally at an abstract level.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of hard treatment usually involves some kind of deprivation. And that could be that one is deprived of money or property, privileges of some sort, liberty, some form of freedom. And sometimes in some places, including the United States, sometimes life itself. So the punishment is a kind of unwelcome, unpleasant treatment, again, imposed on someone because they've broken a law or refused to comply with a command. Now, that kind of practice, obviously extremely old, and some form of it exists in every society. I think of it as justified when it's fair and an effective means to prevent harmful wrongdoing that is legitimately prohibited by law. So lots of dimensions to that, right? So, I don't think you want to be making people suffer unless you're going to prevent a worse evil. So I think making people suffer is bad.
Right. So
if you're going to do it, you better have a really good reason, and that reason probably ought to be that you're trying to prevent a worse evil, right? So, but that's not enough. I think it also has to be the case that when you impose it, that it's fair to those, so that people have an opportunity to avoid the penalty. That is the kind of thing where you want to attach the penalty to a form of wrongdoing that it would be appropriate for the state to prohibit. There are forms of wrongdoing that you might think it's bad that people did it, but maybe the state shouldn't prohibit it or punish anybody if they don't do it. But then there are certain things that's really important that the state try to prevent people from doing those things. And when it does that, people should have an opportunity to avoid those kinds of penalties by complying with the law or complying with the relevant command, or at a minimum having access to processes of due process where they can offer justification for why they didn't, or where they can offer an excuse for why they didn't, and where when they're accused and they didn't do the thing, they have an opportunity to show that they didn't do the thing. So these are all ways of being fair to those who are subject to penalties of this sort. And I think it's only fair when those sorts of due process measures are in place. I mean, I myself don't think that retribution is a legitimate justification for punishment. Many people do, right. I realize. So I don't think it's good in itself that people suffer when they do wrongdoing. I don't think that suffering should somehow be proportionate to how bad they are. And I don't think it's meaningful to talk of people as deserving to suffer, though it might be appropriate that they suffer if they've been forewarned and they refuse to comply, and it's important that we prevent them from engaging in that kind of activity. I think it can be appropriate to make them suffer as a way of preventing actions of that sort. That's different from saying that they deserve to suffer and it's good that they suffer. I don't think that's true.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. That was a nice kind of summary of some of the things we covered in our last season. We talked a little bit about retributive views, but also some alternatives to it. So if new listeners are interested in these topics, you can check out our previous season of the podcast. One of the other things we talked about in an episode last season with Victor Tadros is what we called moral authority and punishment. And there we raised the question of whether and when the state has or lacks the standing to punish. So we wanted to put this question to you too. Do you think there are cases in which the state, perhaps the United States in particular, lacks the standing to punish criminal offenders?
That's a great question. in fact, Tadros has written really insightfully on this set of issues in his books and papers. The way I think about it, well, I think that when the basic structure of a society is seriously unjust, I think that this can compromise the state in a couple of different ways. So it compromises the state's authority to punish a crime, and it also can compromise the moral standing of the state to condemn the crime. So when I think of moral standing, I think of two sorts of issues, right? There's one has to do with authority, and the kind of authority I have in mind here is sometimes someone playing a particular role, they have a right to expect others to comply with what they command, right? So, in a democratic society, we elect people to represent us, and they can lay down laws that say, don't do this, or here's the penalty. Now, some of the things that those with this kind of authority can do is to ask us to do things that are not, say, in themselves morally required, apart from the fact that they're asking you to do it.
Right.
It could. So the kind of authority I'm talking about here is like, they give one kind of example that I sometimes use. You could think of, the selling and use of certain illicit drugs, right? So the law says you can't sell and use these things, but many people disagree about whether it's like intrinsically wrong that people use them. Maybe they think it's not intrinsically wrong, and they might even think it's intrinsically wrong to sell it to people, right? So we could have that kind of dispute about the morality of the use and trade of such narcotics. But when the state has like authority, it can say you don't get to do that, even though it might not be intrinsically wrong, and you might disagree with the state, but the state can claim this of you. But I think that kind of authority is only really wielded by a state in a reasonably just society. So when society is marred by all kinds of structural injustices in it's a state's failure to prevent those injustices or to enable the kinds of reform that would create a more just circumstance, then I don't think it's reason for the state to think that it has that kind of authority to be demanding these things of people and demanding this kind of compliance. Now, that might be different from a different kind of legitimacy that has to do with kind of the right to enforce certain things. So there's some things that are just wrong in themselves, and they're really bad. So it's bad to just murder people, and any of us can try to take action to try to prevent it. And in some cases, the appropriate way to do that is for a state power, to try to prevent people from murdering others. And it might be the case, I think it can be the case, that the state could, even under unjust circumstances, could try to prevent people from doing things like murdering others, even though it doesn't really have the kind of authority that I just spoke of, right? Doesn't, because that's compromise, but it could be permissible for it to take certain actions to prevent really serious wrongs. And or at a minimum, it would be those of us living in such a society might have reason to allow it to play that role without trying to prevent it from doing so. So when I think about standing, it's sort of complicated. It's some of it is a standing of authority, some of it is a standing of the moral standing to kind of condemn things, and that could be limited because when the state is failing to create just circumstances, it is often complicit in the wrongdoing that occurs. Right? It's well known for decades now. We know a lot of crime that happens because people are living under rather burdened circumstances that that are unfair to them, that they have to live under those circumstances. And if it's the state's fault, the state's in part at fault for why they do these things, and that might affect whether it will be appropriate to condemn others, to blame them for doing these things when you are at least co-responsible for. So there can be a kind of compromise in moral standing in that sense to condemn and blame. They can be a compromise in authority to expect compliance with your commands, and yet a retention of the right to try to get people to comply with certain rules that prohibit things that are intrinsically wrong and cause great and irreparable harm.
Yeah. You have a book, The Idea of Prison Abolition, in which you take stock of the problems with incarceration, especially in the United States today, and ask whether we should abolish or simply reform the practice. So could you talk about some of the existing injustices in the American prison system?
I could talk all day about that.
That's a big question.
Yeah, it is. Maybe I'll go at a slightly higher level of abstraction and thinking about like what the prison abolitionists are objecting to. And we can kind of circle around to the kind of problems in the existing practice. So I think the abolitionists are objecting not just to existing injustices, of which there are many, and many reformers would agree there are many. I think they're trying to say something a little deeper. They're objecting to the practice of imprisonment itself, kind of as such. And they're objecting to it because they think that it is inherently and incorrigibly wrong. And they also think that it's, as a practice, is an ineffective practice at providing public safety and also unnecessary because I think there are alternatives. So if you just focus on the first part, that the practice of imprisonment, this is inherently and incorrigibly wrong. Here you could focus on lots of different features of the practice that should be probably familiar to most people. One feature is that the practice of imprisonment is often used, maybe liable to be used as a mode of political repression. This has been true historically in all different types of societies. Often those with power, when they face resistance or dissent, they will resort to imprisoning their enemies, their political enemies. And this is a widespread practice, and equipping the state with the power to incarcerate, gives the occupants of government the power to use it for this purpose. And it's a kind of abuse that's very common and extremely worrisome. You might also be worried that the practice is sort of inherently dehumanizing. I think it's often in practice dehumanizing because there are lots of things that we needn't do, but there are ways in which we treat those in prison, as if they were just animals to be kind of tamed, but not as persons, and so not respected in the way they ought to be respected. And we put them in conditions where people can't maintain basic dignity, right? So, and we can talk about some of the features of how prisons are structured that could lead to that. And of course, those with authority over prisoners can often abuse that authority and be arbitrary in all kinds of ways in their treatment of people. If you think, as some people do, that the prison is the place you go to be punished, this place you go to be tortured and mistreated,
right,
then you can expect it to be a dehumanizing place. If you think, as I do, that the incarceration is the punishment, not the place you go to be tortured, but that particular deprivation of your freedom of movement and being constrained in these ways, that is the punishment. Then there's no reason to make it kind of an intolerably painful and undignified circumstance as it often is. And many abolitionists have other objections. Sometimes they think the practice is too akin to slavery, looks too much like slavery. Sometimes they think it's exploitative in other ways because they see the ways in which, in a global capitalist system and, commerce, enterprises for profit intersect with the criminal justice system in all kinds of ways, including incarceration. And it's for many people object to the role of corporate firms in the practice of imprisonment. Some people think the practice is racist. if not inherently racist, it's liable to be racist in a society with such a long history of racism, and liable to be used as a mode of racial subordination. So there are a range of objections that people might have to it that are just on moral grounds. They just think it's just wrong. In addition to thinking that it's not really very good at securing public safety, and we have alternatives. So those are among the things. And I try to, in my book, to walk through as carefully as I can each of those objections and others, to think through, well, how powerful is it? How powerful are those objections? They're very powerful to the practice of imprisonment as we know it, as it exists in the U.S. I think there's some limits if they're meant to be an objection to the practice as such. If they're meant to be an objection that says you could never have a prison that didn't have these flaws.
Yeah,
I think there are some limits, and I try to discuss both the strengths and the weaknesses along those lines.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So
I guess we'll return to the question of what reforms you think are needed. So what problems you do see existing in the system of incarceration today. But before that, I thought it would be worth asking, since your view is that, while prisons are in need of reform, the practice of imprisonment, of incarceration, is not essentially illegitimate. Could you say what role you do see prisons as playing, and how you draw from work by prison abolitionists without becoming an abolitionist yourself?
Sure. So if you take the way I'm thinking about what punishment is, right? So it's a form of hard treatment, kind of unwelcome, unpleasant treatment as a penalty for lawbreaking or refusing to comply with certain legitimate orders. Now, those penalties take lots of different forms. Sometimes it's a fine. Sometimes it confiscates your property. Sometimes you have to do community service. Sometimes you got to wear an ankle monitor or what have you, right? So incarceration is a kind of penalty, very severe one, obviously. Mm-hmm. And as a penalty, it works similarly to the others in that it's meant to be a way of discouraging people from engaging in that kind of conduct, right? So that's the general deterrence part. Mm-hmm. We have laws. The laws have penalties attached to them. If you do this kind of thing, it's very likely you'll receive a penalty of a certain sort. That's all made explicit. And that's meant to discourage you in the same way that, if you drive more than 20 miles over the speed limit, then you might get a ticket, but you might confiscate your car if you're caught, right? And that discourages you from doing that. So that's the deterrence feature of it. Mm-hmm. But incarceration has a couple of other dimensions that are not really comparable to, say, fines or property confiscation. One of them is that, it can be, and under some circumstances, it might be appropriate to try to engage in a kind of moral reform of those who've done the thing that's wrong. We describe this as rehabilitation, without distinguish from treatment, if the person's ill, right, from the case of moral reform, where you think that there are problems in their character or problems in their ability to restrain themselves from acting wrongly, that requires intervention of a moral reform, and providing rehabilitation services, while people are incarcerated, can be a way of preventing wrongdoing, since the vast majority of people who go to prison get released. And so part of it is putting them in a position for them to re-enter society as an equal among us without being a danger to our liberty and person or property. So incarceration can be a space where that happens, where people wouldn't perhaps otherwise avail themselves of that kind of rehabilitation. But there's also incapacitation. So there's some similarities to other kinds of punishments with incapacitation. So if you think of it broadly enough, you think, what are we trying to do? We're trying to deprive the person who's committed a wrong of the means of committing wrongs of that sort, right? Mm-hmm. So we're trying to, or make it hard for them, right, to do it. Mm-hmm. So sometimes we do that in other penalties, right? We might, if we think this person is a reckless driver and repeatedly driving while drunk, we'll suspend their license. It might confiscate their vehicle. Now, of course, it doesn't entirely prevent them, because they could still get in somebody's car or something. but you're trying to deprive them of the means of continuing to do the wrong. So sometimes in the case of incarceration, we're trying to do something similar, right? Where we're thinking we're dealing with a person who is a dangerous individual, doesn't seem deterrable, and may be inclined to continue to behave in the ways they have, or maybe even worse. And so part of what we do is remove the means of them doing that, at least, or we inhibit them, put it that way, from doing it by incarcerating them. We can't entirely remove it because, prisons have staff and other prisoners, so they could obviously harm those individuals. And so there's some limits to preventing a person entirely from harming other people. But you can severely limit their ability to harm others and put them under kind of constrained circumstances so that they aren't able to do that. So when I think of the kind of penalty that incarceration is, the prison is, it has all three of these functions. It's partly a deterrent to discourage people from engaging in harmful wrongdoing. It's partly a way of creating conditions in which they might be rehabilitated, and they might engage in moral reform and be inclined to restrain themselves and not need the state to restrain them. And sometimes the state does need to restrain people because they're just dangerous individuals. And that, of course, that could be true because a person is ill. So sometimes a person their mental illnesses are sufficiently debilitating that they aren't able to bring their behavior in line with the relevant moral and legal considerations. Right. And so sometimes we have to incapacitate someone because that's true of them. That's different from punishment, because there we wouldn't impose punishments. You think the person was capable of conforming to the law, but didn't and refused to. So I think that there's a difference between the case where we're punishing and when we're treating, even though in both cases we might be using institutional confinement to deal with the problem.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think I spoke to. To quickly say something about some of the things I think abolitionists are correct about, because a lot of the book, to be fair, is critical of abolitionist arguments, but I don't view the book as the case against abolition, because I think that they're on to many good things, and lots. I wouldn't have written a book if I didn't think there was nothing to it. So I think there is something to what they're saying. I think they're correct about a number of things. I've mentioned a few briefly. I mean, one thing we've already talked about a little bit, and we'll talk about just in a little bit more in a second, just they're very good at pointing out existing injustices in the prison system. They draw our attention to that. It's very easy because, especially in the United States, it's very easy to ignore the problem because the prisons are usually not in public view. They're off somewhere in a rural area. You don't know what's going on behind those big concrete walls. And so they draw attention to that and force you to think about how we're treating others, and many of whom are our fellow citizens. They also, I think, are right that prisons are greatly overused. We've kind of gotten in a habit of using it to deal with every kind of wrong, whether it's really a serious wrong or not. And I think they're right to force us to reconsider that, because I think we have lots of other things we can do to respond to lesser crimes other than throw people in a prison. And because I think our ability to control crime is very sensitive to our technological situation, our abilities to control crime have been enhanced by technology. There are other things that we can do to monitor people and to ensure that they, or at least increase the likelihood that they will comply with the law without having to actually confine them in an institution with others. And so I think that the abolitionists are right to kind of call for decarceration. They don't think this, but I think this. Let's limit the use of prisons to really the most serious crimes that we don't have another way to respond to. The ones that cause the kind of great irreparable harm, like murder, violent rapes, where great trauma is caused, and it's just really important that people not actually do the thing. And that would cut out a lot of other things where you would use other means to try to deal with it. I think abolitionists are right to tell us to aspire to something more than just incarcerating people. Let's aspire to social conditions where we don't really need to resort to a practice of this sort. And if we can get in that position, that would be great, especially for those of us who don't think retribution is the justification for punishment. If we think it's really for public safety, if we could achieve a reasonable level of public safety without the use of incarceration, I think that would be good.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can't. I think that the right to aspire to that as something we should be trying to do. Let's try to create conditions where we could have as much safety as anybody could reasonably want without having to confine someone for years, where they might be subject to all kinds of abuses and inhumane treatment. So I think they're right about that. And I think maybe more fundamentally, they're right that you're not really going to have meaningful, lasting criminal justice reform if you don't also tackle the injustices in the broader society. Yeah. And a lot of what abolitionists are about that.
Mm-hmm.
They think we got a deeply unjust society and world, and we fall back on prison rather than deal with these broader structural injustices. So I think they're right that should be the thing that we tackle. It's hard to do, obviously, but to try to make the kind of changes in a society where prison isn't the default, or maybe where it's not needed at all. So I think on those grounds, I think they're on the right track and are pushing us in the right direction.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Mm-hmm. So what are some reforms you think could be made of our practices of imprisonment? And how would you respond to an abolitionist critic, somebody like Angela Davis, who thinks that reforms are not enough?
Yeah, there's so many things we could and should do. And one thing I should say is that it's many of the things I think that would make sense to do, you don't really have to reinvent the wheel because other societies do these things. The fact that, some societies don't and some do. And we can learn from the ones that I think that do better in this domain. Mm-hmm. Among the things that would make sense to do is, bail reform. And there's a movement that thinks that we shouldn't really be relying on cash bail at all, or it should really only be used in a very limited way. So if the point of bail is to ensure that people are subjected to accountability measures, that they come to the hearing, and so on, you don't really need to confine them in a jail or make them pay a bunch of money to ensure that. It's much easier to, again, it's technologically sensitive too. It's harder to evade accountability than maybe it used to be, right? There's one thing like, the point where there's a vast frontier of the West and you murder somebody, you just get lost
right.
In that frontier, right? But that's not our situation. It's very hard to just disappear in our world. Now, it's different, and maybe you need to sometimes hold someone because they're dangerous. That's a different reason. Mm-hmm. But just holding them just to ensure that they show up for trial, that seems, especially, you haven't proved that they've done the thing.
Right.
So I think bail reform, sentencing reform, criminologists have been working on this for years and trying to insist that this is no reason to be giving people 30-year sentences for things. Yeah. It's almost no matter what they do. It's like, if you're trying to prevent crime, it's probably counterproductive. You prevent the crime with much lower sentences. You don't need to go to that level. And there are many things people do that it's hard to justify giving people those sentences. And insofar as people think it's justified, I think it's largely because they're attracted to, revenge and retaliation. They think that, and that leads them to wanting to ramp up the penalty. So sentencing reform, there's, John Pfaff has a great book. It's called Locked In, I believe, where he, I think, does a pretty good job, maybe the best, at trying to think through the problem of prosecutors. And so there's a movement afoot about thinking about how to appoint or elect progressive prosecutors because prosecutors have a ton of power. It's largely unchecked. And some people would say that's a big part of why there was an explosion of prisoners, right? Just piling up charges and then making people, accept a plea bargain where they end up with all these years and so on. And then you do that against the background of another reform that, or should the lack of a reform. Many people, defendants have very limited access to legal counsel.
Right.
So if you're in a situation where if you don't have money, then you're kind of at the mercy of the prosecutor, because public defenders are totally overworked and they have so many cases. It's very difficult to provide you that kind of adequate defense. So the combination of prosecutorial authority combined with the limited access, especially for people with modest means, to get access to legal counsel, is those two in themselves is going to lead to, I think, over incarceration. Sometimes there'll be some. I mean, there are things that just have to do with prison conditions, and again, you can learn from other places, right? That, better if people in a single occupancy cell than with others. In most cases, cells could be much larger than they are.
Yeah. People
should have access to libraries and other kinds of things, and sanitation. People need access to fresh air, natural sunlight. People need to be able to be in contact with their family and friends on a regular basis. I mean, prisoners often report that the thing that they find, most horrible about prison, apart from it being extremely boring, is they don't have contact with their loved ones, and they feel disconnected from them. Mm-hmm. And that's horrible, because I don't think that should be a part of the punishment. The punishment isn't to deprive you of contact with your family and friends. And so facilitating regular contact through letters, through visits, through electronic communication and the like, phone calls, I think is a key to ensuring that the experience isn't one that's kind of permanently traumatizing for those inside, but that sort of they're able to re-enter society in a way that's connected with others who care about them, which it will better enable them to participate as an equal among the rest of us.
Mm-hmm. That was great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Tommie. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Probably the easiest thing is my personal website, which is just my name, TommieShelby.com. Tommie is with an I-E, mm-hmm. So TOMMIE Shelby.com. That's the easiest way to follow what I'm up to.
Great.
Yeah, thanks again, Tommie.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course, yeah.
In our next episode, we'll talk about ambivalence with Justin Coates, professor of philosophy at the University of Houston.